The manager search may have gone quiet for the moment, but that hasn't stopped Chelsea getting involved in all of the news. Specifically today, we're talking about strikers. Supposedly, Chelsea have made an inquiry about Brentford's superstar striker this season, Igor Thiago. And the rumour mill is also suggesting that Barcelona are interested in our superstar striker, Joao Pedro. Welcome, Blue Believers, to another episode of the Stamford Sync, where we are syncing up with everything Chelsea FC. And I took a few days off. I've been wildly busy in the studio making tunes, and as soon as I've got something to show you guys, if you're interested, let me know in the comments and I'll put it across. But guys, let's not waste any more time and we will just dive into today's news. So, Chelsea Dodgers posted this via ESPN Brazil. Brentford knows it will be tough to hold on to Igor Thiago. Atletico Madrid, Chelsea, Juventus and Milan have made inquiries for him. Brentford want 80 million. Woo, it's a lot of money. It's a lot of money, but he has scored 21 goals in the Premier League this season, so that is quite impressive. He's also a lot younger than I thought he was initially. I think he's 25 at the moment, but he's 24, 25, and in and around the same sort of age profile as Joao Pedro is. So, look, he's having an absolutely wonderful season. I think that's, it's kind of there for everyone to see, isn't it? He's been an absolutely brilliant striker. He's really, really helped Brentford have an amazing season. And it makes sense that a lot of teams are interested in him. So the Atletico Madrid one is interesting because it also seems like Julian Alvarez might be on the move because he is just absolutely smashing it over there. So it's starting to look like that we might see a striker merry-go-round happen in the summer. So pertaining to Joao Pedro, Transfer News Live posted this via Marca. Barcelona have identified Joao Pedro as their top target to replace Robert Lewandowski this summer. The 24-year-old striker is the club's preferred option, with Lewandowski set to leave at the end of the season as a free agent. Julian Alvarez's reported 130 million price tag would be way too much for Barca. So there you go. It's all connected. It's all connected. I'm not even sure where Julian Alvarez would go at this point. Like, Harry Kane is still doing pretty well over at Bayern Munich, so you wouldn't have thought that he'd be leaving there anytime soon. Man City have got Erling Haaland. I mean, I guess like Arsenal, Liverpool maybe for Julian Alvarez. It's, he seems like he's probably going to be the most expensive striker on the market this season, if he even wants to leave Atletico Madrid at all. But I'm sure if someone comes in with a massive bid, they won't turn it down. Pertaining to Joao Pedro, I mean, I don't put a huge amount of stock in this, to be honest, because Joao Pedro, we've only had him for a season. We bought him for 60 mil, so even if we did get like 80 million or something for Joao Pedro, like the same sort of price that's being quoted for Igor Thiago, I don't know, it just doesn't really seem like a good idea, I think, at the moment. Joao Pedro has had a tough season, but he's kind of bookended it with amazing performances. It was obviously a big dip in the middle. He's not exactly on red-hot form at the moment, but he's absolutely smashing it in the Premier League in the grand scheme of things. And for me personally, we're going to have this conversation about, comparing the two strikers and what it'd be like. Of course we are, because that's what the video is about. But in my general opinion, I don't think we should even be thinking about selling Joao Pedro. So, if Joao Pedro desperately wants to move to Barcelona and they come in with a figure for him that ends up being profitable, yeah, I guess it could happen. But either way, I just don't think it's a good idea. So guys, before we get into the comparison, if you are enjoying the content and would like to see more, please do me the distinct honor of liking and sharing the video, subscribe to the channel, or just roast me in the comments, whatever gets you through your day. So guys, before we get into the comparison, we're going to do what I like to do with these situations. I like to look at the heat maps. We're going to look at the heat maps for Joao Pedro and Igor Thiago. And here they are, plain as day. Now, there's not a huge amount of difference in it, to be completely honest. It does look like we're seeing kind of similar strikers, but what I do find interesting here, Igor Thiago's heat map shows that he is getting wider, and that is, Joao Pedro is definitely spending a lot more time in the middle of the park. And obviously we understand that because he's like a bit more of a creative playmaker kind of striker who likes to drop deep. But in general, Joao Pedro seems to be occupying the half spaces a lot more. And not to say that Igor Thiago isn't, but at the same time, Igor Thiago is actually, look at that, the left and the right in the, just the lead up to the box there, the left and the right side on Igor Thiago's heat maps are really, really strong. So he is getting out wide, which is interesting at the end of the day. Now, I don't necessarily know if that would work particularly well in our team, but that is kind of almost like a Nicholas Jackson style thing, isn't it? And we've got Emmanuel Omega coming in who kind of does that thing as well. So not a huge amount to glean from the heat map. Sometimes you get a real interesting picture of the differences between two players in their heat maps. It looks like Igor Thiago runs a lot more, if I'm completely honest, because in general, he just seems to look like he covers more ground. So maybe he's a bit more of an athletic player. But at the same time, not a huge amount to glean from these other than by the looks of things, Igor Thiago is spending a lot more time getting out wide. He generally, I think, covers a bit more ground by the looks of things in general, whereas Joao Pedro seems to kind of hover more in similar spots. I think Igor Thiago is covering more ground in general. And what you can tell, I guess, is the big thing here, Igor Thiago spending more time in the box. Joao Pedro has a good box presence, but also, I guess the thing that hurts Joao Pedro in this respect is the first half of the season he had with Maresca, where he wasn't spending as much time in there as well. So that's not even necessarily indicative of the type of player that they are. More, Igor Thiago has had the entire season with one manager, who was a set-piece coach, which is absolutely wild. And obviously, Joao Pedro is now on his third manager of the season, with Callum McFarlane taking the wheel twice. But obviously, Maresca and Rosiña both played quite different styles, and he seemed to, Joao Pedro definitely seemed to perform better under Rosiña than he did under Maresca. Right, so let's get into the comparison. In the event that Joao Pedro goes to Barcelona or someone comes in for him, and we have supposedly made inquiries about Thiago anyway, even if we were to keep Joao Pedro, what are we looking at? Is it an upgrade? Is it a backup? Is it, a different type of striker that we thought we had in Liam Delap? Now, I'll tell you this before we get into the conversation. Igor Thiago, much better than the Liam Delap. So as far as having two strikers goes, I'd rather have Thiago as a backup or a secondary option than Liam Delap. So I found this handy-dandy comparison that shows us the Premier League stats of Joao Pedro versus Igor Thiago. Now, Joao Pedro obviously at Chelsea, Igor Thiago at Brentford. So they are both the starting strikers for their teams. Joao Pedro has played 32 times in the Premier League this season. Igor Thiago has played 34. With Joao Pedro, he actually spent a reasonable amount of those games playing in the centre of attack as well. In the middle of the season, obviously Cole Palmer was out, Buonanotte wasn't really preferred, Liam Delap had just come back. We did start seeing quite a lot of Joao Pedro in the number 10. Joao Pedro started 28 of those games and Igor Thiago has started 33. So, Joao Pedro, more versatile. We'll get into that. You'll see that in the stats as we go on. And Igor Thiago is just their starting striker. And it makes sense. He's brilliant. He's having a really, really good season. Minutes played, very similar, actually, which I find interesting, which shows you that even though Joao Pedro has made less starts and ultimately played less matches than Igor Thiago is getting taken off a little bit more than Joao Pedro is. With 2,404 minutes for Joao Pedro and 2,494. So essentially, despite playing, in 2 extra games and making 5 extra starts, Thiago's only played one more game than Joao Pedro this season. Goals. So this is where it starts getting interesting, right? 14 goals for Joao Pedro in the Premier League this season. He's got 19 in the season total and 21 for Igor Thiago, which I think is now second. I think Erling Haaland has scored more goals than that now, but Igor Thiago has been chasing the top scorer in the Premier League for the entire season, which is ridiculously impressive for a Brentford striker in particular. So moving on, this is where things start to get a little bit more interesting, and that 21 to 14 all of a sudden doesn't seem quite as far in front as you would think. Now, Joao Pedro, penalty goals, none. Joao Pedro has not taken a penalty for Chelsea in the Premier League this season. Obviously, for the most part over the last few years, Cole Palmer has been our penalty taker, and in his absence, it's fallen to Enzo Fernandez, who seems to be our penalty taker as well. Now, Igor Thiago has scored 7 penalties this season, so both players have scored 14 open play goals. Which changes things a little bit, doesn't it? Because you would have thought, I don't know how many penalties we've had in the season, actually, I'll have to look that up at some point, but you would have thought that if Joao Pedro was taking our penalties, that number would be a lot closer, wouldn't it? And his season tally would also have been a lot better as well. So I think that's probably the most important piece of information in this entire graphic. Obviously, we're going to get into some more stuff, but Thiago is taking the penalties for Brentford and Joao Pedro is not taking them for Chelsea. So when we're looking at open play goals, we're looking at the same thing here. So it's not as clear-cut as Igor Thiago is a better striker than Joao Pedro because, Igor Thiago has also played more games, but at the same time, he's in a Brentford team that doesn't maybe have quite as much in the way of, creatively fluid players and stuff in order to feed him the ball. But either way, I do find that very interesting, and it just kind of dispels a little bit of the myth, doesn't it, in terms of, don't get me wrong, Thiago's doing such a good job this season, but at the same time, Joao Pedro is matching him in open play goals, which really is the most important thing. So this is also where it gets interesting, and Joao Pedro wins back some flowers. Assists, 5 assists in the Premier League for Joao Pedro this season, which puts his GA up to 19, and only 1 for Igor Thiago. So Igor Thiago is not that kind of striker that has all of this other stuff to his game. Maybe a little bit like Liam Delap. Obviously better than Liam Delap. I'm not saying he isn't, but at the same time, Joao Pedro offers a lot more in terms of what else he can provide for the team. We know he likes to drop deep and he likes to facilitate, and we're not really seeing much of that from Igor Thiago. So that, if you kind of mash that up with the fact, if we take away the penalty goals, and a goal scored is a goal scored, don't get me wrong, but the GA then all of a sudden is massively weighted in Joao Pedro's favour, with 19 GA for Joao Pedro and 15 for Igor Thiago. So all of a sudden it starts to feel like a downgrade, because penalties are penalties. We're always going to have someone to score those penalties. And even if it isn't Joao Pedro and it is a Cole Palmer or an Enzo Fernandez or whatever, those goals are getting scored for the most part anyway. So I just think that actually is really, really, really interesting, that if we, the instant thing you see is 21 goals for Igor Thiago, 14 for Joao Pedro. But as we start to dig a little bit into the minutiae of the situation, things start to change. So we'll move on to XG, expected goals. Now, I think these stats are actually really important in general. And we've also got the non-penalty XG, which does change things a little bit. So Joao Pedro's expected goals is 13.7 this season, which means by a hair, he's overperformed his XG. Igor Thiago's expected goals is 19.1. Now, that is including penalties at the moment. We'll get onto the non-penalty in a second. So, both players overperforming their XG, which is good. That is what you want from a top-level striker at the end of the day. The best strikers in the Premier League, in the world, everywhere, outperform their XG. And Joao Pedro, albeit by a hair, has outperformed his XG this season. Things change and get a little bit more interesting when we move into the non-penalty XG. Obviously, for Joao Pedro, that doesn't change because he's not taking penalties. But then Igor Thiago, as expected, his XG drops to 12.8. But having scored 14 goals, he is still comfortably outscoring his XG. But then all of a sudden, Joao Pedro has a higher XG. So in terms of open play goals, Joao Pedro is expected to score more goals than Igor Thiago. Igor Thiago has just done a better job of putting them away. So I do find that really, really interesting. Now, for the assist numbers, this is where things start to get a little bit crazy with Joao Pedro in particular. Joao Pedro's XA, expected assists, is 1.92. So he has overperformed his expected assist number by double. Do you know what I mean? We're literally 2.5. He's got 2.5 more assists essentially than he's expected to. And Igor Thiago has underperformed that assist metric with a 1.8 expected assists, but he's only managed one in the Premier League. So instantly, this is where you start to see player styles at the end of the day, and that is really, really important, I think. But I do think it's really interesting. Joao Pedro is outperforming his expected creative output in terms of assists, and that is another reason why I just think that, when we take away the penalties, and I know, like I say, it's disingenuous a little bit, but when we're just looking at what they're doing on the pitch in open play, Joao Pedro is actually really, really far in front of Igor Thiago this season. So even though Igor Thiago has had such a good season, all of a sudden, the idea of swapping him out for Joao Pedro doesn't feel like a good one. Now we move on to chances created, and as you would expect, with Joao Pedro being a more creative player, he is outperforming Thiago on this metric as well. 28 chances created for Joao Pedro, 22 for Igor Thiago. Next one, really interesting as well, and tells you a little bit more about the kind of players that they are. Big chances missed. It's like every single time I read those three words, I just think about Nicholas Jackson. But in this respect, Joao Pedro actually doing pretty good in terms of the XG that he's had. He's only missed 11 big chances, whereas Igor Thiago has missed 18. So Igor Thiago is getting into positions for more big chances, but Joao Pedro more clinical, because what we're talking about is in the open play stuff, Joao Pedro is missing a lot less of those open play chances than Igor Thiago is, which ultimately makes him more clinical, which is really, really good. So shot accuracy, kind of as you would expect, I guess. Igor Thiago 64% to Joao Pedro's 59%. So Igor Thiago takes that one. And the overall FOTMOB rating, because that's where all these stats are from, 7.18 for Joao Pedro and 7.19 for Igor Thiago. So, and again, I would be really interested to see what that stat looked like without the penalties, because I don't know, I just think it's really important. Like, at the end of the day, I remember being really excited and buzzing about Cole Palmer when he scored like 24 goals in the Premier League season, but a lot of those were penalties as well. But at the same time, I do think just in terms of looking at the striker that you're going to get on the pitch, all of a sudden this does change the picture a little bit. So guys, that's it. That's the comparison. That is the comparison. We're looking at Igor Thiago and Joao Pedro. Now, I don't really expect us to sell Joao Pedro, if I'm being completely honest. I think that's absolutely wild, and I'm not really sure. I mean, 80 million for Igor Thiago is a lot when you think that we spent 60 mil on Joao Pedro in the first place, and they've had very, very, very similar outputs. Now, you would surmise, I guess, that, with fit and informed Cole Palmer and, Enzo Fernandez and the likes of Joao Pedro also being able to facilitate, you would have thought that Igor Thiago would probably be able to kick on quite a lot and be able to put up some really good numbers in a Chelsea shirt if we manage to, kind of fix the rest of our team. I do think it's interesting. I think we probably need 3 strikers next season. I don't really want those to be Liam Delap and Mark Yu on the bench. If we're not going to keep Nicholas Jackson, it would be interesting to see if we went in for someone like a Thiago, but it does just feel like a lot of money. So guys, let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for sticking around until the end of the video. If you did, I'll catch up with you all very, very soon. Take it easy. Peace.